Okay, I want you to just imagine this scene. You're standing outside in the dead of winter.
And not just, a bit chilly.
No, I mean minus 20 degrees. It's the kind of cold that just hurts your face.
No, the kind of weather where every instinct is telling you to stay inside, find a heater, and just wait.
Exactly. But in the scene we're looking at today, thousands of young men are doing the opposite. They're pouring into the streets. They don't have weapons. They're not geared up for a fight. They're just marching.
And that's the opening image from the document we're analyzing today. The date is February 5, 1997. The place is Ghulja.
It's such a stark image. And it's the start of what our source material calls the Ghulja Revolution.
Which is a really loaded term to begin with. Revolution.
It tells you a lot about the perspective of this document. Today we're doing a deep dive into a transcript from a commemorative video about this event.
And we should be clear about that perspective right up front. Absolutely. This source is highly, highly emotionally charged. It's written from the viewpoint of Uyghur activists, so it uses very strong language like invaders, martyrs, and enemy when talking about the Chinese government.
So our job here isn't to take a side.
Not at all. Our job is to report on what this document says, to understand the narrative it's presenting, why they saw this as a revolution without, validating every single claim as objective fact. We're analyzing its perspective.
Right, we're trying to understand what led to that march in the freezing cold. Because the text makes it very clear this didn't just happen overnight.
No, it was the absolute boiling point. The document spends most of its time laying out the decades of pressure that led up to that moment. It goes way back.
All the way back to the 1950s.
Yep. The source argues that as soon as the Chinese government took control, a sort of systematic process began, but not with physical violence initially. According to the text, the 1950s were about targeting the mind.
This part was fascinating. The document claims these political movements were launched specifically to remove the pillars in the community.
Right. It lists them out. Intellectuals, religious scholars, wealthy people, factory owners.
Basically anyone with influence or knowledge.
And think about what that does. If you take away the people who teach, who lead, who employ, what's left?
The source is pretty blunt. It says the goal was to leave the population poor and ignorant, a strategy of, cultural decapitation.
Exactly. But then the narrative shifts. If the 50s were about the mind, the document frames the 1980s as an assault on the body itself. And this is where the claims get terrifying.
You're talking about the nuclear testing.
I am. The source claims that before 1980, the government conducted atomic tests right in their homeland.
And it describes the aftermath. Strange diseases, radiation effects.
Yeah.
It paints this picture of a people who feel like their very environment has been poisoned.
It's an invisible enemy. You can't fight radiation. It creates this profound sense of helplessness.
And the source connects this directly to another policy it mentions after 1980.
The brutal birth control policy.
Yeah, the language there is very stark. It frames it not as family planning, but as an attempt to literally stop the next generation from being born.
So you see the picture it's painting. By the time we hit the 1990s, the source has described a community that feels leaderless, poisoned, and biologically suppressed.
And that's when a new crisis hits, a crisis of the youth.
The text describes a whole generation of young men who are just lost. There's massive unemployment, no future. And that void gets filled with, as the source calls it, poisonous habits.
Drugs and alcohol. Heroin, specifically.
And the source has this very cynical take on it. It argues this wasn't an accident of poverty, but that the moral decay was allowed, maybe even encouraged, to weaken the nation from within.
It's a really hopeless image. But then, right at this low point, the community finds what the text calls a cultural antidote.
They reach back into their own traditions.
And they find the mashrap.
The mashrap.
Now, when I first read that word, I just assumed it was, a party or a get-together.
And it is, but it's so much more. The source calls it a folk school, a traditional gathering for moral upbringing.
So it's basically a grassroots intervention program. Religious figures and intellectuals revived this tradition to save the youth from drugs.
The goal was to give them a sense of self again, to help them recognize their religion, their responsibilities, to create people of conscience and faith.
And this is the part I just love. They didn't just do it through lectures. They found a brilliant way to operationalize it.
Football.
Yes. The source literally says, our people are a people who love football. So they fuse this deep moral education with a football league.
It's genius, really. If you want to get young men off the street, you give them a team. You give them discipline disguised as a game.
And it worked. The text says it became incredibly popular. Young people started getting clean, they were finding purpose.
They were building community. They were building unity.
And that's where the trouble starts.
That's always where the trouble starts, isn't it? According to the source, this awakening, this unity, was something the government could not tolerate.
So the Football League worked a little too well.
Precisely. The text says the government declared the mash rap illegal. They started arresting the young men who were organizing the games.
And then they took it a step further. This detail is just so symbolic.
The tractors.
They sent in tractors to plow up the football fields.
Can you imagine that? The one good thing you have, the one constructive outlet, and they literally send a tractor to tear it up so you can't play anymore.
It feels like the final straw in the narrative. The source argues that this action proved the government was an enemy that wouldn't even let them save themselves through peaceful means.
It backed them into a corner. The source quotes the youth saying, "Should we just wait to be arrested and finished off?"
It's the logic that if you do nothing, you lose for sure. If you do something, you might lose. But at least you did something.
And that brings us right back to February 5th, 1997. They couldn't play football, so they decided to march.
So let's go back to that scene. Thousands of young men from these mash-up groups marching from 3 different directions towards the city center.
And the source is so careful to emphasize they had no iron or weapons and insist this was peaceful. But the message was anything but passive.
They were carrying banners with the Kalima Shahadat, the Islamic Declaration of Faith.
Which completely reframes the conflict, doesn't it? It's no longer just about politics, it's about faith.
And their chants. The text says they were shouting that obeying the invaders, the government, was haram, forbidden by God.
That is an unbelievable line to cross. You're essentially declaring that being a good citizen is a sin against God. You're rejecting the state's legitimacy on a spiritual level.
The sentiment, as the source quotes it, was basically, hey, invaders, get out, this land is ours.
So you have this huge, peaceful, but incredibly defiant crowd, and then the crackdown.
The source describes it as suppression with blood. It alleges that the military opened fire on the marchers.
The language here is, as you'd expect, very graphic. It talks about people being martyred on the spot, others being rounded up, imprisoned, or executed later.
It's a picture of total tragedy. But what's so striking is how the document frames the outcome.
You'd expect it to be a story of defeat, right?
Totally. We tried and we were crushed. But that's not the tone at all.
No. The source frames it as a moral victory. The argument is that silence would have been a shame on human history. By standing up, even though they were killed, they proved they weren't asleep. They cleansed their honor.
So success wasn't about winning the fight. Success was about fighting the fight.
Exactly. It completely redefines victory. The text argues that living in obedience is a fate worse than death. The victims are called Shahid martyrs, who are now alive forever in paradise.
And this all builds to the document's final call to action. It's a message for the future.
It tells the next generation to treat resistance as a religious duty, a fard, an obligation. It says to view the government as an enemy and that helping the invader is a sin.
It's just,
Yeah.
there's no compromise there. It draws an incredibly hard line in the sand.
And that, according to the source, is the real legacy of Ghulja. It solidified that divide. It convinced a generation that there was no middle ground to be had.
What a journey. From intellectual purges and nuclear fears to a football movement and a tragic march.
It really shows how a moment like that is never just a moment. It's the culmination of everything that came before.
So the key takeaway here, from this document's perspective, is that this wasn't about politics in the end. It was about identity.
They felt they had to choose between their safety and their soul. And on that day, they chose their soul.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground. Thank you for listening to this deep dive into the Ghulja Incident and the match rap movement.
But before we go, I want to leave you with one final thought. The source we've analyzed today makes a powerful argument that the confrontation became inevitable only when the peaceful, constructive outlets like football and the mash rap were shut down.
It really makes you think. When you close every peaceful door for a community to express its identity, what other doors are you leaving open?
Something to mull over.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.